The moon hung high, casting an eerie glow over the dense, isolated woods. Rachel and Mike had been driving for hours, desperate to reach their mountain cabin before dark, but the winding roads had grown more unfamiliar with each turn. The GPS, their once reliable guide, now stubbornly displayed no signal. The silence in the car thickened, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Rachel finally asked, glancing nervously out the window at the endless shadowy trees. "Not really," Mike admitted, "but we're too far in now. We'll be fine. I think I saw a turnoff back there. Maybe it's a shortcut." They backtracked, the car tires crunching on loose gravel as they took a narrow, unmarked road barely visible from the main path. It twisted into the woods, seeming to close in around them as they drove further in. A sinking feeling settled over Rachel. Something about this path was wrong. As they rounded another bend, they saw an old wooden cabin, its outline stark against the night sky. The windows were dark, but a faint light flickered within, like an ancient oil lamp swaying in a breeze. "Maybe someone inside can help us with directions," Mike suggested, already climbing out of the car. Rachel hesitated. "I don't know, Mike. It looks abandoned." "Just give me a minute. I'll ask and we'll get out of here," he replied. He started up the creaky steps and knocked. The door swung open on its own, revealing only darkness beyond. "Hello?" Mike called. The silence stretched, oppressive and thick. Then came a faint shuffle, a whisper of movement inside. Before Rachel could say anything, he stepped over the threshold, disappearing into the shadows. A prickle of fear crawled up her spine. She got out of the car, calling after him, but there was no answer. She took a step closer, peering through the doorway, but the darkness seemed to absorb her gaze, pulling her in like a silent tide. Suddenly, the flickering light inside went out. She turned, heart hammering, and sprinted back to the car. She fumbled with the keys, her fingers trembling, but the engine only coughed and spluttered, refusing to start. Desperation rose, clawing at her throat as she glanced back at the cabin. Her mind screamed to leave, to run, but Mike was still inside. Rachel took a deep breath, gathered her courage, and went back to the door. The darkness inside was now complete, but she steeled herself and stepped in, feeling along the wall for any sign of a light switch. Her hand brushed against something sticky. She yanked her hand back, stifling a scream. "Mike?" she called softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Silence. Then, from deep within the cabin, she heard a faint, dragging sound. She forced herself forward, her footsteps hesitant on the creaking floor. She reached a narrow hallway where the sound grew louder. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she followed it, each step a test of courage she wasn't sure she had. She turned a corner, and there he was, or what was left of him. Mike lay crumpled on the floor, his face frozen in terror, his eyes wide and glassy, staring up at something Rachel couldn't see. Blood pooled around him, still wet, glistening in the faint moonlight that seeped through a crack in the wall. She backed away, bile rising in her throat, her vision blurring as she turned to run. But she wasn't alone. A figure stood blocking her path, face obscured in shadow, eyes glinting cold and dead. Rachel froze, paralyzed with fear, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the figure's voice. "You took the wrong turn," it said, its voice barely more than a rasp, like wind rustling through dry leaves. She tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat as the figure reached for her, its fingers cold and skeletal. She stumbled back, tripping over Mike's body, her vision swimming as the figure loomed closer, dark and consuming. The last thing she saw was its face, contorted into a smile, wide and wrong. The next morning, a hiker passing through the area discovered an empty car parked on the narrow road, its door hanging open, keys still in the ignition. The cabin, however, was gone. Only an empty clearing remained where it once stood, overgrown with weeds and vines as if it had never been there at all. Weeks later, a local rumor began circulating, an old legend revived among the townsfolk. They whispered of a cabin that appeared on moonlit nights, an illusion that led lost travelers deeper into the woods where they would never be seen again. Only their cars would be found, waiting on the edge of nowhere, marking the place where they'd taken the last wrong turn. The heavy rain came down in sheets as Ben drove down the lonely mountain road, wipers struggling against the downpour. He was heading back home after a weekend of camping in the Rockies, eager to get back before nightfall. The road twisted and turned, with no other cars in sight, just endless, dark forest pressing in on either side. But after about an hour, he saw it. A battered, rusting sign by the road that read, Old Pine Lodge, 10 miles ahead. Ben frowned. He was pretty sure he hadn't passed anything like that on his way in. But the storm was getting worse, and the lodge seemed as good a place as any to wait it out. He turned down the narrow road, his headlights barely penetrating the mist that clung to the trees. The road to the lodge felt endless, winding further into the forest until he finally saw the building come into view. It was an old, Victorian-style lodge, towering and strange, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. The windows were dark and the front porch sagged, but a dim light glowed from inside, casting strange shadows on the walls. Ben parked, squinting through the rain, and headed up the steps, noticing a strange smell in the air, like something damp and decaying. He shivered but knocked on the door. He waited, glancing around the eerie, overgrown yard, wondering if anyone was actually there. Just as he was about to turn back, the door creaked open. An elderly woman stood in the dim light, her face lined and expressionless, her eyes unsettlingly dark. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice almost a whisper. Ben explained about the rain and asked if he could wait inside until it passed. She nodded slowly, gesturing for him to enter. He stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind him. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, its weak glow casting the old furniture and faded wallpaper in shadow. There was a strange silence in the lodge, like a place long abandoned, yet somehow not. The smell was stronger now, and Ben fought the urge to cover his nose. "Do you live here alone?" he asked, trying to break the silence. The woman's gaze fixed on him, unblinking. "Yes, just me, and the others." He laughed nervously, thinking she was joking, but her expression didn't change. "The others?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked down a hallway, leaving him alone. Ben looked around the room, shivering. Everything looked like it had been frozen in time, as if the lodge hadn't changed in 50 years. There were dusty photographs on the walls, faded black and white pictures of men, women, and children, all with the same lifeless expressions. He felt a prickling on the back of his neck, a growing sense of being watched. He turned to see another figure, a tall, thin man, who had seemingly appeared from nowhere, standing at the edge of the room. His face was blank, eyes distant, almost as if he wasn't actually seeing Ben at all. "Hi," Ben said, forcing a smile. "Are you a guest here too?" The man didn't reply. He just stared, his eyes unfocused, and after a moment he turned and disappeared down another hallway. Ben's unease deepened, his heart pounding. He decided he'd wait in the lobby a few more minutes, then head back to his car. Just then he heard faint footsteps above him coming from upstairs. They were slow and dragging, like someone walking with a heavy weight. He glanced up, and as he did, a chill washed over him. In the dim light, he saw a figure at the top of the staircase, a little girl in an old-fashioned dress, standing utterly still, staring down at him. Her eyes were wide and dark, empty of emotion, her skin pale and sickly. Ben's stomach dropped. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say a word, the little girl pointed at him, her finger trembling. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He felt a wave of dread roll over him, thick and suffocating. His feet seemed glued to the floor as the other figures, the woman, the tall man, and now another young boy with hollow eyes, appeared at the edge of the room, surrounding him, their expressions blank, but somehow angry. Their dark eyes bored into him, unblinking and cold. He stumbled back, heart racing, as the woman from before stepped forward. Her face was twisted now, her mouth curving into an unnatural smile. "You're in our lodge now," she hissed, her voice raspy and harsh, echoing in the silence. "And we don't take kindly to visitors who don't leave." The others advanced, closing in around him. He turned and bolted for the door, yanking it open, stumbling out into the rain-soaked night. He sprinted for his car, feeling their presence behind him, closing in with every step. When he reached his car, he jumped inside, heart hammering as he fumbled with the keys. As the engine finally roared to life, he glanced back at the lodge. The figures stood on the porch, their eyes reflecting in the headlights, watching him with unblinking stares. The little girl raised her hand, waving slowly, and Ben felt a chill so deep he nearly gasped. He hit the gas, speeding away from the lodge, his hands shaking on the wheel. He didn't stop, didn't look back until he reached a town hours later, far from the winding mountain roads. As he pulled over to catch his breath, he noticed a paper on his dashboard. It hadn't been there before. With trembling hands, he unfolded it. It was an old, yellowed flyer for the grand opening of Old Pine Lodge, dated 50 years ago. Below the date, a handwritten note read, "Thanks for stopping by. You're welcome back anytime." It was supposed to be a simple drive through the countryside. Laura had been on her way to visit an old friend she hadn't seen in years. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the rolling fields and trees. She should have been close by now, but the road twisted endlessly through the forest, feeling as though it led deeper instead of onward. She checked her phone. No signal. The GPS had given up an hour ago, and now, with the last bit of daylight fading, a sense of unease began to creep up on her. As she rounded a sharp bend, she saw a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a young woman in a tattered dress, her hair hanging loose around her face, eyes wide and desperate. Laura slowed down, rolling down her window just a crack. "Are you all right?" she called out. The woman looked at her, her eyes pleading. Please take me with you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I need to leave this place." Laura hesitated, but something about the woman's fear struck her. She unlocked the door and gestured for her to get in. The woman climbed in, silent except for her shallow breaths, and Laura noticed her hands trembling. "Thank you," the woman said quietly, staring out the window as Laura continued down the road. "They don't usually let people leave." Laura glanced at her. "Who doesn't?" But the woman didn't respond, her gaze fixed firmly on the darkening trees outside. They drove in silence for a while, the air in the car heavy, almost suffocating. Finally, Laura tried to make small talk. "Were you lost, or—" "I was taken," the woman interrupted, her voice hollow. "I don't remember how long I've been out here waiting for someone to stop. They never come. But you did." She turned to Laura, her eyes reflecting something Laura couldn't quite place. Relief, maybe, or perhaps fear. Laura's skin prickled. She didn't know what to say, and the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly. She felt as though she'd been driving for hours, but there was no sign of any town or any other cars. Just endless, dark forest closing in on both sides. Suddenly, the woman grabbed Laura's arm, her grip ice cold. "Don't stop," she whispered, her voice urgent. "Whatever happens, don't stop." Laura opened her mouth to ask why, but then she heard it. A faint sound coming from behind them. It was like distant footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the night. She glanced in the rearview mirror but saw nothing but darkness. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Just drive," the woman whispered, clutching Laura's arm so tightly it hurt. Laura pressed harder on the gas, her heart racing as the sound grew louder, closer. It was a scraping, dragging noise now, like someone pulling something heavy along the ground. She didn't dare look in the mirror again, but she could feel a presence, dark and ominous, lurking just beyond the car's rear window. Is it following us?" Laura asked, barely able to get the words out. The woman didn't answer, just kept her eyes forward, her face pale. "If you see something in the road ahead, don't stop," she whispered. "It'll try to make you stop, but you can't, not until we're far enough away." Laura's grip on the steering wheel tightened as she squinted through the windshield. The forest had grown thicker, the trees pressing closer, their twisted branches clawing at the car as she sped down the narrow road. Then she saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road up ahead, its form barely visible in the dim headlights. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated and bent at odd angles. Its head tilted slightly as it watched them approach, unblinking. Laura's instincts screamed at her to stop, but the woman's words echoed in her mind. "Don't stop." Her foot pressed down harder on the gas, and she swerved around the figure, her heart pounding as it passed inches from her window. She caught a glimpse of its face, a hollow, expressionless mask with dark, empty eyes that seemed to watch her as they sped by. "Good," the woman breathed, a hint of relief in her voice. "We're almost safe. Just a little farther." But Laura was losing her nerve. The road seemed endless, twisting and turning through the thick forest, and the air in the car grew colder, her breath fogging up the windshield. The strange dragging sound was back, closer now, as if something was following right behind them, keeping pace. "Look," Laura gasped. "We're not getting anywhere. This road, where does it lead?" The woman was silent, her expression unreadable. But then she spoke, her voice barely audible. "This road is a trap. It's a place for those who wander too far, who stray from where they should be, like me, and like you. What? Laura's heart pounded harder, the weight of dread settling over her. But then why did you want to come with me? The woman turned to her, her expression shifting to one of profound sadness. Because I needed someone else to take my place, she whispered, her voice laced with sorrow. I'm sorry. I didn't want to be alone anymore. A sick realization washed over Laura as she looked at the woman beside her, her form now faint, almost transparent. She wasn't alive. She had never been alive. Not anymore. The car's headlights flickered, and the road seemed to ripple, twisting and turning like a living thing. In the rearview mirror, Laura saw the figure again, closer now, its hollow eyes fixed on her. She hit the brakes, but the car wouldn't stop. The road stretched ahead, endless and dark, dark, as if she'd become part of it, forever driving with no destination. And as she glanced over, the woman was gone, leaving Laura alone with the endless road and the hollow, unblinking figure growing closer in the mirror.